This lecture is about spinal nerves. We're going to look at the naming and numbering of spinal nerves. We're going to look at the spinal cord cross-section and the parts and the labeling. We're going to talk about neuromodalities and neural mapping. This lecture will probably be actually in two parts. So you will look for spinal nerves 1 and spinal nerves 2. So when we talk about spinal nerves, we see that there are 31 pair of spinal nerves. You always have a right and a left. And their name depends on which location they emerge from. So when we say name, that's like cervical, lumbar, thoracic. Number depends on which order they're in. So in the cervical region, spinal nerves are named and numbered for the vertebra they emerge superior to. We have an exception though. Spinal nerve C8 emerges between vertebra C7 and T1. It's the only spinal nerve that does not correspond to a vertebra. So 7 cervical vertebra, 8 cervical nerves. And so I've taken this drawing or this photograph from the lab, and I've pointed out the individual cervical nerves. The one with the little blue pipe cleaner attached to it is C8. Normally we start at the top and we start just counting down from there. Normally I used to draw this on the board, so I've made an attempt to draw this on the board, where if you have the skull itself, and then you have the vertebra, which I've numbered C1 through C7, and in the hot pink, I've done the nerves, C1, 2, C3, etc. And then I change color for C8 so that you can see how it emerges inferior to C7. So each of these spinal nerves in the cervical region is named for the vertebra they emerge superior to. And then the rules change. In the thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx regions, the spinal nerves are named for the vertebra they emerge inferior to. So I started this drawing with C7 as the vertebra, and I showed that nerve C7 emerges superior to vertebra C7, and then I put nerve C8 back in between C7 and T1 vertebra. And then I'm showing how the thoracic, T1, T2, T3, etc., down to T12, the thoracic nerves are named, numbered for the vertebra they are inferior to. So vertebra T1, inferior to that is nerve T1, and so on and so forth, all the way down to T12. Then I did the lumbar region, which I drew, and I showed that T12 is inferior to vertebra T12, and then L1, L2, L3, L4, L5 is inferior to vertebra. Nerve L5 is inferior to vertebra L5. Whoops, I have a blank. There is sacral. I'm sorry, I had a blank slide in there. So if I put L5 back in and I redraw the sacrum, the sacral spinal nerves emerge out of either the ventral or the dorsal sacral foramina, which I talked about when we did axial in lab. So you can see that S1 comes out through the first sacral foramen on down, and then S5 and CO1, because there's only one coccygeal nerve, emerge out through the sacral hiatus. So that is how we name and number spinal nerves. Now, if I look at the spinal cord cross-section, and this is a model in the lab of the cervical, you can tell it's cervical because we have a bifid spinous process. It actually shows the arteries coming up through those transverse foramen. The spinal cord is surrounded, or is within that ventral foramen, which is now filled with spinal cord. The dorsal root, is this yellow wires. My arrow's slightly off. So the dorsal root is the yellow wires coming off versus the ventral root is the lower set of wires. And they come together, and you can actually see this line in between. That line in between, so is the ventral root. Dorsal root ganglia is in the middle of that space, and where they totally, completely merge together, where I'm circling in red now, is where the spinal nerve actually is, and it comes out from the vertebra between that intervertebral foramen, and then it splits into the dorsal and ventral primary ramus. The word ramus means branch. Roots obviously are going into something to hold something up. So sometimes this model can be very confusing. So what we do instead is we have this picture, this is from the lab book. In fact, I photographed my lab book to get this better picture. So that we have this drawing of the cross section of the spinal cord. So you have the spinal cord, which is central nervous system. And then as soon as you are off of the spinal cord, we're going to draw the red lines now, everything lateral to the actual spinal cord is peripheral nervous system, which is PNS. And we see that we have the ventral root is the inferior in this drawing. So if you want to think about this, this is posterior at the top of the drawing and anterior at the bottom of the drawing, because ventral means anterior. So you have the ventral root. We have the dorsal root, which is the whole piece. And in the middle of the dorsal root, you have the dorsal root ganglion. And when you have a ganglion, I gave the definition of a ganglion is a collection of neural cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. It doesn't have to be very far out. It's just not part of the spinal cord, so it's called a ganglion. And that is how you can always orient yourself on this drawing if you're looking at it, because only the dorsal root has a ganglion. So if you're looking at it and it's upside down, you can reorient it because you know that the only ganglion there in a root is part of the dorsal root. Where the dorsal and ventral roots fuse, we get the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is where we combine things together, and then it's going to split again to go either dorsal to the back or ventral to the anterior. So we have the ramus. So roots to spinal nerve to ramus. The plural of ramus is rami. So I'm going to write that word down here at the bottom. Rami, R-A-M-I. It means the plural of ramus. So there is a second drawing from the lab manual that I brought up. And the key to this one is it shows the things that are off of the spinal nerve. And we usually use this one when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. It's called the paravertebral ganglion. So we had one ganglion that was in the root, which was the dorsal root ganglion, which if you look at the slide above is this one here. And then coming off the spinal nerve itself, we have something called the paravertebral ganglion. And it's part of a chain of ganglia, and it's still a collection of neural cell bodies. So that is the cross-section and the pieces of that.